Berlin, January 1933. The Weimar Republic still stands, its constitution intact, its institutions operating, its president in office. Yet beneath this outward normalcy, the state is exhausted. 14 years of crisis have hollowed it out from the inside: hyperinflation, political murder, mass unemployment, and a parliament that can no longer govern. What remains is a shell held together not by law, but by habit, and habit is failing. What almost no one realizes, not even the men at the center of events, is that the Republic has already entered its final month. Only weeks earlier, the November 1932 elections had appeared to deliver a turning point. The Nazi Party, once unstoppable, had suffered its first major electoral setback. Millions of votes vanished, seats were lost. Worse still, the party's finances collapsed. Years of relentless campaigning had emptied its coffers. Creditors demanded payment, payrolls went unmet. The myth of Nazi inevitability, so carefully constructed, suddenly looked fragile. Even inside the movement, doubt spread. And yet, in private rooms across Berlin, a very different story was beginning to unfold. At the center of the crisis stood three men, each convinced the future could be bent to his will. Adolf Hitler, furious but undeterred, remained excluded from power and increasingly desperate. Franz von Papen, recently dismissed as Chancellor, burned with resentment and a desire for revenge. And Kurt von Schleicher, the current Chancellor, believed he alone possessed the political dexterity to stabilize Germany. Each man thought the others were finished. Each was wrong. The unraveling had begun months earlier. Schleicher had orchestrated Papen's fall with ruthless precision, maneuvering behind the scenes to replace him as Chancellor. Papen never forgave the betrayal. To him, Schleicher was not merely a rival, but a personal enemy, one who had humiliated him and cast him aside. As Christmas approached, Papen began quietly plotting his return, convinced that Schleicher's government was weaker than it appeared. Hitler, meanwhile, watched closely. Shut out of office since August, mocked by conservatives and abandoned by former allies, he recognized something others missed. Schleicher's authority rested on illusion. The Reichstag was paralyzed, no coalition functioned. Presidential rule by emergency decree had become routine. One wrong move could bring the entire structure down, and Hitler was prepared to exploit it. The decisive moment came on January 4, 1933. On that cold winter day, Hitler and Papen met in Cologne at the home of Kurt von Schrader, a banker with deep connections to conservative elites and Nazi financiers. They arrived separately, intending discretion. Instead, photographers captured both men entering the same building. The secret was exposed almost immediately. Berlin buzzed with speculation. Something significant was happening, something dangerous. Inside the house, the atmosphere was tense. Accusations flew. Hitler blamed Papen for blocking his rise in 1932. Papen blamed Schleicher for betraying them both. What united them was resentment and ambition. They spoke not as allies, but as men searching for leverage. Hitler was blunt. He would not serve as a subordinate. He would not accept a symbolic role. He would only enter a coalition government as Chancellor, nothing less. Papen listened carefully. He offered assurances, cabinet posts, influence. He spoke of control, of constraints, of conservative dominance. And together, they discussed the removal of Social Democrats, Communists, and Jews from positions of public life, early signals of the regime that might follow. Outside that room, the Republic trembled, unaware how close it had come to the edge. News of the meeting spread rapidly. Newspapers speculated openly. Was Papen attempting to persuade President Paul von Hindenburg to appoint Hitler Chancellor? The reaction in government was immediate. Schleicher, alarmed, demanded that the president forbid further contact between Papen and Hitler. Publicly, Hindenburg agreed. Privately, he did something far more dangerous. He told Papen to continue. This was not a decision made lightly. Hindenburg distrusted Hitler. He considered him vulgar, radical, unfit for high office. But the president was tired of instability, tired of elections, tired of being asked to rule by decree. Papen assured him that Hitler could be controlled, boxed in, neutralized. That reassurance would echo again and again in the days to come. The Republic, meanwhile, was being undone not by mobs in the streets, but by conversations held behind closed doors. If you're finding this unraveling as chilling as it is fascinating, now is the moment to support the work. Liking the video and subscribing helps ensure these stories reach more people because history only warns us if we're willing to listen. As January advanced, the pace of intrigue accelerated. Schleicher remained confident, convinced that Papen was finished and Hitler was weakening. He believed the Nazi financial collapse would restrain them. He believed fear of civil war would force moderation. Above all, he believed that Heikert von Schleicher was indispensable. But power was already slipping through his fingers. Papen continued his quiet maneuvering, visiting old contacts, speaking in half-truths, promising stability while plotting disruption. Hitler, for his part, sensed opportunity. His movement might be broke, but it was disciplined. His demands might seem extreme, but desperation on the right was growing. Each day without resolution made compromise more likely. And still, Schleicher did nothing to stop it. He trusted the system. He trusted the president. He trusted that no one would dare pull the final thread. He did not yet understand that the Republic's fate was no longer being decided in the Reichstag, but in private homes, whispered conversations, and meetings never meant to be recorded. The stage was set, the actors were in motion. And Germany stood unknowingly at the edge of an irreversible descent. In January 1933, the Nazi Party should have been finished. On paper, it was bankrupt, fractured, and reeling from electoral defeat, and yet, within weeks, it would appear reborn, revitalized, and marching once more toward power, as if the laws of political gravity no longer applied. That resurrection did not come from the streets, nor from mass enthusiasm. It came quietly through bank transfers, private guarantees, and the confidence of men who believed radicalism could be financed, then restrained. In December 1932, the situation inside the Nazi Party was dire. Years of relentless campaigning, election after election, had drained every reserve. Debts mounted, credit dried up, the party's newspapers struggled to print. Its vast propaganda machine threatened to grind to a halt. Even Hitler's inner circle understood the danger. Without money, momentum would collapse. Without momentum, discipline would fracture. And without discipline, the movement could devour itself. To outsiders, Nazism looked like a failed gamble. Then, suddenly, it didn't. In the days following the Cologne meeting of January 4th, something remarkable happened. The Nazi Party's financial crisis eased almost overnight. Debts were assumed, creditors were reassured. Funds flowed once more, industrial magnates stepped in, assuming responsibility for Nazi liabilities, convinced that any stability was preferable to paralysis. Franz von Papen denied involvement, insisted he had arranged nothing, but the timing was unmistakable. The party's revival began precisely when Papen and Hitler aligned. Money, in this moment, did more than sustain a movement, it restored belief. With resources secured, Hitler moved swiftly to rewrite the narrative of decline. He did not return immediately to Berlin. Instead, he traveled to the Free State of Lippe, a small, provincial region with barely more than 100,000 voters. Strategically, it mattered little. Symbolically, it mattered immensely. Over 11 days, Hitler campaigned relentlessly, visiting 16 towns and villages. Halls filled, banners flew, speeches echoed with promises of renewal and discipline. The rallies were smaller than those of earlier years, but they were intense, tightly organized, emotionally charged, and designed to project strength rather than desperation. On January 15th, the results were announced. The Nazis won 39.5% of the vote, 5% higher than in November. Hitler seized on the outcome immediately. This, he declared, proved that the movement was resurgent, that the setback of November had been an illusion, that Germany was once again turning toward National Socialism. The press amplified the claim. Supporters believed it, opponents hesitated. A local election had been transformed into a national signal. The myth of inevitability was reborn not through victory in Berlin, but through narrative control. While Hitler reconstructed momentum, Kurt von Schleicher drifted further into delusion. On the very day of the Cologne meeting, January 4th, Schleicher resumed negotiations with Gregor Strasser. Once a major figure within the Nazi Party, Strasser had left the movement entirely. Stripped of influence, loyalty, and organizational power, he represented nothing. And yet Schleicher treated him if he still held the key to splitting the Nazis, imagining a cross-front alliance that could stabilize the Reichstag. It was political necromancy bargaining with a corpse. As January wore on, Schleicher's position deteriorated rapidly. His economic promises failed to materialize. His attempts to appease agricultural interests collapsed when he refused to raise tariffs. The Agricultural League, once sympathetic, denounced him publicly. On the left, Social Democrats remained hostile. On the right, nationalists withdrew patience. The Reichstag, fragmented and bitter, offered no support. And yet Schleicher remained convinced the system would hold. He believed the Reichstag would never vote no confidence, fearing another election. He believed the president would not abandon him without a clear alternative. He believed that Papen was isolated, that Hitler was weakened, that time was on his side. Every belief was wrong. Behind the scenes, Papen continued maneuvering, quietly presenting himself as the indispensable intermediary, the man who could tame Hitler, stabilize the cabinet, and preserve conservative dominance. His confidence rested on a single, catastrophic assumption that Hitler needed him more than he needed Hitler. In reality, the balance of power was already shifting. The Nazi Party was no longer broke. Its internal morale had been restored. Its leader projected strength. Schleicher, by contrast, stood increasingly alone, unsupported, mistrusted, and blind to the fact that the real negotiations had moved beyond him entirely. By mid-January, Berlin politics had taken on a strange unreality. Publicly, Schleicher governed. Privately, he was being bypassed. Decisions were no longer debated in parliament or announced in decrees. They were whispered in drawing rooms, scribbled in diaries, and negotiated in meetings meant never to be known. Germany's fate was no longer being decided by votes but by confidence, fear, and misjudgment. And as Hitler prepared his next move, Schleicher remained convinced he still controlled the board. He did not yet realize that the game was already lost. By mid-January 1933, the center of gravity in German politics had shifted decisively, though almost no one noticed. The Reichstag still existed, the Chancellorship was still occupied. Laws were still issued in the president's name. But the real decisions had slipped into the shadows, where power no longer spoke publicly and accountability dissolved into silence. The next phase began on January 18th. That evening, Adolf Hitler and Franz von Papen met again, this time in Berlin, at the home of Joachim von Ribbentrop. The precautions were extraordinary. Hitler's car drove directly into the garage to avoid detection. Papen arrived separately, shielded from attention. Nothing about the meeting suggested routine politics. This was conspiracy, conducted with the careful paranoia of men who knew the stakes were existential. Ribbentrop, meticulous and ambitious, recorded the substance of the discussion in his diary. One issue dominated everything else. Hitler was unmoved, inflexible, and unwavering. He would only participate in government as Chancellor. There would be no compromise, no symbolic office, no gradual ascent. Either he led or he destroyed what remained. Papen still believed he could manage this. He imagined a cabinet dominated by conservatives, with Hitler isolated, constrained, and neutralized. Vice-chancellors, ministers, procedures, these were, to Papen, mechanisms of control. Hitler, he assumed, would be grateful for inclusion and softened by responsibility. That assumption would prove fatal. Outside Ribbentrop's house, Berlin moved on unaware. Newspapers reported routine politics. Civil servants drafted memoranda. Schleicher continued governing as if nothing had changed. But the future of Germany was being negotiated beyond his reach. by men who no longer felt bound by the forms of the Republic. For days later, on the evening of January 22nd, the decisive meeting took place. This time, the circle widened. Oskar von Hindenburg, the president's son, arrived, accompanied by State Secretary Otto Meissner. Their presence transformed the gathering. No longer was this merely Papen and Hitler negotiating leverage. This was proximity to the presidency itself. The meeting was hidden behind spectacle. That evening, Oskar and Meissner appeared publicly at the opera, smiling, visible, unremarkable. Then, under cover of darkness, they slipped away and made their way to Ribbentrop's house. Appearances were preserved, reality unfolded elsewhere. Earlier that same night, Hitler had addressed a massive rally at the Berlin Sportpalast. It was a carefully staged event, honoring the Nazi martyr Horst Wessel. Memorials were unveiled. Rituals performed, discipline displayed. The movement presented itself as unified, solemn, and powerful, an organization capable of order rather than chaos. Power was being projected outward while negotiated inward. Inside Ribbentrop's house, Papen conveyed President Hindenburg's position. The president still did not trust Hitler as Chancellor. He found him reckless, dangerous, socially unfit. Papen spoke as a mediator, suggesting alternatives, seeking flexibility. Hitler refused. He would not enter any government unless he led it. And if Schleicher's government came before the Reichstag, the Nazis would not support it. Without them, no government could survive. The Republic, balanced on parliamentary arithmetic, trembled. Then came the most opaque moment of the entire crisis. Hitler and Oskar von Hindenburg withdrew into a private room for over an hour. No official record survives, no transcript, no diary entry captures what was said. What remains are fragments, later recollections, and consequences. Oskar would later claim that Hitler warned him bluntly, no government could endure without Nazi support, and only Hitler could prevent civil war. The threat was implicit, not explicit. Order or chaos, stability or collapse. But other pressures hovered in the background. A Reichstag inquiry loomed into the Eastern aid scandal, allegations of corruption involving government funds distributed to landowners, including friends and relatives of the Hindenburg family. The inquiry threatened embarrassment, exposure, and disgrace. Whether Hitler mentioned it directly is unknown. Whether silence or protection was implied can never be proven. What is certain is this: when Oskar von Hindenburg emerged from the room, his position had changed. He spoke only one sentence: the Nazis must be brought into the government. That sentence mattered more than any speech, election, or decree. With Oskar convinced, the final barrier between Hitler and the chancellorship weakened. The president trusted his son. Papen sensed victory. Hitler had achieved what months of elections had failed to deliver: legitimacy at the center of power. And still, Kurt von Schleicher remained unaware. He continued to believe Papen was isolated. He continued to believe Hitler was bluffing. He continued to believe that fear of instability would protect him. Even now, as alliances formed behind his back, Schleicher trusted in restraint, tradition, and rational self-interest. History would remember this as his final illusion. If this moment feels uncomfortably familiar, if you recognize how quietly democracies can be undone, then supporting this work matters. Subscribing and liking the video helps ensure these stories reach beyond the already convinced, reminding more people how fragile political systems truly are. By January 22nd, the outcome was no longer uncertain. It was merely unannounced. Papen had positioned himself as kingmaker. Hitler had refused every limitation. The president's inner circle had shifted. Schleicher stood alone, governing a state that had already moved past him. The Republic still breathed, but only barely. Within days, the last misstep would be taken, and no one involved would admit responsibility until it was far too late. By the final week of January 1933, the Weimar Republic had not yet collapsed, but it had lost control of its own fate. The decisive conversations had already taken place. The critical alignments had already shifted. What remained was not a struggle for power, but the slow, almost ceremonial confirmation of a catastrophe set in motion by miscalculation. Kurt von Schleicher still occupied the chancellorship, but he governed in a vacuum. On January 23rd, Franz von Papen reported the results of the January 22nd meeting to President Paul von Hindenburg. He did so carefully, selectively. Papen understood the president's lingering distrust of Hitler and avoided recommending him outright. Instead, Papen emphasized necessity. Schleicher, he argued, could no longer command support. The Nazis, whether liked or not, were indispensable. Stability required accommodation. Hindenburg remained unconvinced. Personally, he still preferred Papen himself as chancellor. He regarded Schleicher as ineffective, but Hitler as dangerous. Yet the president was increasingly boxed in by realities he did not fully control. Parliamentary paralysis persisted, public confidence eroded, and his own inner circle, most importantly, his son, had shifted position. While these conversations unfolded at the top, Schleicher's base collapsed beneath him. The Nationalist Party withdrew its support. The Agricultural League, already alienated, offered no rescue. In the Reichstag, Schleicher could no longer rely on any stable bloc. His government stood isolated, neither commanding a majority nor capable of suppressing one. Still, Schleicher believed he had time. On January 20th, he was offered a lifeline, a proposal to recess the Reichstag until the new budget, buying months to stabilize the situation. The maneuver would have delayed confrontation, postponed a vote of no confidence, and preserved his position temporarily. Schleicher rejected it. Instead, he ordered the Reichstag to convene on January 31st. It was a decision rooted in confidence and fatal misunderstanding. Schleicher believed that fear would govern behavior, fear of another election, fear of instability, fear of civil conflict. He believed no party would dare bring down the government. He believed that, when faced with the consequences, his enemies would retreat. He misjudged them all. Behind him, alliances had already dissolved. Ahead of him, power had already migrated. Papen, no longer constrained by loyalty or office, maneuvered freely. Hitler, no longer desperate for compromise, waited with confidence. The president, weary and isolated, listened increasingly to those closest to him rather than to constitutional abstractions. The final days passed quietly. There were no mass demonstrations, no coups, no emergency decrees announcing dictatorship. Berlin functioned normally, cafes remained open. Newspapers printed routine headlines. The Republic died not in a scream, but in a whisper. By the time Schleicher understood the scale of his isolation, it was too late. He could no longer form a majority. He could no longer govern by decree without provoking backlash. And he could no longer persuade the president that he represented stability. Within days, Schleicher would resign. Within days, Adolf Hitler would be appointed Chancellor of Germany. Not by revolution, not by insurrection, not by popular uprising, but by men who believed they could use him. January 30th, 1933 arrived without drama. No barricades, no sirens, no immediate terror. There was champagne in drawing rooms, handshakes in corridors. Diary entries written with satisfaction. Conservatives congratulated themselves on having outmaneuvered both the left and the radicals. They believed Hitler was contained. They believed the cabinet would control him. They believed the Constitution would restrain him. Every one of them was wrong. The Weimar Republic ended not because it was overthrown, but because it was surrendered, piece by piece, by those who thought themselves too clever to fail. And the world would spend the next 12 years and far longer paying the price.